Welcome to the 10th edition of ACCA Insurance Day. My name is Natalie Stevenson, and on behalf of the ACCA team, we are delighted to welcome you with us. Following the pandemic, this event was reorganized into an online format in order to reach a remote audience. And thanks to this technology, we welcome over 1,000 professionals to our online event today. This is an incredible achievement which coincides with the 10th anniversary of this event. So just to give you a quick summary of the proceedings today, we will have a webinar which is made up of 2 parts. Secondly, we will have the box of questions, which will be a dynamic discussion with 10 interviewees discussing Luxembourg as a financial sector. Third, we have the ACCA Insurance Innovation Awards, which we host for the 3rd consecutive year in partnership with LOFT, the Luxembourg House of Financial Technology. All of our materials will be available online on www.accainsuranceday.lu. So to kick off the discussions today, we start with an expert talk on the subject of cross-border business and freedom to provide services. This is an incredibly important subject for the Luxembourg market and one which is gaining political attention in Brussels and beyond. I will pass over to Valerie, who will lead this discussion with our 4 distinguished experts. Thank you, Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, for this introduction, and good morning to all of you. Welcome to this expert talk of ACCA Insurance Days 2022. We all know that one of the goals of the European Union is to establish a single market within its borders. In this context, the freedom to provide services and the freedom of establishment offer consumers a greater variety of products at more affordable prices. Due to the proximity of its neighboring countries, Luxembourg has always been a pioneer in the free provision of services, where most of the services developed and offered are aimed at European consumers. The historical links to international finance and the nature of its activities represent the DNA of Luxembourg, and insurance is one of its flagship initiatives. In this framework, the overwhelming majority of life insurance premium collection and most non-life activities carried out by Luxembourg-based companies are outside its borders. Given the current trend towards nationalist behaviors and an increasing tendency towards protectionism observed in most countries, it is crucial that Luxembourg takes a stand in favor of a European regulatory framework that takes into account the international and cross-border nature of financial services in general and of insurance in particular. With us today to debate on the future of cross-border insurance, Petra Ilkema, chairperson of EIOPA, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority. Being unfortunately unable to be with us this morning, Petra recorded a short video allowing us to better grasp the prudential aspects linked to cross-border business. Claude Virion, Honorary President of the Executive Committee of the Commissariat aux Assurances, the Luxembourg Supervisory Authority of the insurance sector. Having overseen the sector from 2015 to 2020, you are part of the insurance success story in Luxembourg, and you will share with us your past experience and your views on the current trends. Florent Albert, Managing Director Europe and Group CFO of Lombard International Assurance in Luxembourg, with over 20 years of experience in financial services, you will give us your point of view from an international life perspective and explain us how you encounter more and more impediments to freedom to provide services in your day-to-day business. Richard Williams, you moved to Luxembourg as General Manager of Convex Europe in November 2021. You will shed light on how your non-life business is for sure international by nature, and why this cross-border dimension is so important both from a market and policyholder perspective. And finally, Angus Corgi, you are head of the Prudential Regulation and International Affairs at Insurance Europe, the European Insurance and Reinsurance Federation. Being based in Brussels and close to the European political sphere, you are responsible for advocacy on a range of topics, and you will share your views on the current review of Solvency II from a cross-border business supervision angles. So good morning to all four of you, and thank you again for participating in this live discussion. I will now leave the floor to Petra, who will give us her view on cross-border insurance, keeping in mind that main goals of EIOPA are, among others, to improve consumer protection and to ensure a strong, effective, consistent regulation and supervision across the EU.
Good morning, everybody. And let me start by saying thank you to you, Valérie, for inviting me to today's conference, as well as to join this session. And I'm very sorry I can't make it in person, but I'm grateful that I get to give some introductory remarks to just kick off the discussion today. Cross-border insurance is a very important part of the European insurance market. And Luxembourg is well known for being an insurance and reinsurance hub for cross-border insurance products sold under the freedom of establishment and the freedom of services throughout the internal market. Speaking more broadly, cross-border insurance business models are a positive thing, both for insurers and policyholders, and they are developing further across the Union. The digital transformation of the financial sector, accelerated by the pandemic, is playing a key role here. We see more and more services provided cross-border through the freedom of services by using digital platforms to reach consumers throughout the EU. Cross-border premiums have been going up steadily in the last 5 years compared to domestic premiums. And in most cases, these services are to the benefit of European consumers. New and more efficient distribution channels help to reach more consumers and provide them with more choice and better prices. So far, so good. But hey, I'm a supervisor, so we also need to discuss the risks. For, of course, with these business models, there are also risks, and that is where supervision comes in. At EIOPA, our goal is to ensure a high, effective and consistent level of supervision across Europe so that we can guarantee a similar level of protection of policyholders and beneficiaries across the entire EU. We have put in place cross-border cooperation platforms so that when needed, we can enhance stronger and more timely cooperation between home and host supervisors and enable a quicker identification and assessment of risks, as well as a response to the findings. These platforms are an example of how EIOPA has been able to better steer cooperation and information sharing between national supervisors, supporting their assessment of the impact of cross-border activities and identify preventative measures. For the internal market and home member principle, these can only function if agreed rules of the game are applied in a consistent way, and are, when needed, enforced at the national and the EU level. This is why supervision is so important. Failures of insurance companies, even only trouble with certain products of insurance companies, can cause significant detriment to the policyholders and thereby disrupt the trust in our industry, in our sector. And that is something we need to avoid. For while we avoid this, we can enjoy the benefits. Look at Luxembourg. Luxembourg is maybe a relatively small market in Europe, but it is also one that has been able to build a strong, pretty big business across Europe, thanks to EU regulatory frameworks that enable these business models. Now, That is what I have to say about it. I'm sure there's a lot more to say in this session. So I wish you a very good discussion going forward, and I thank you again for the opportunity to kick it off. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Petra, for these introductory words and setting the scene for the discussion. I'm sure your fellow panelists will certainly react to some of your comments during the expert talk. Let's now start with Luxembourg, few figures and a bit of history, and see how important cross-border business is for the country. I would like to mention here that this morning's session will concentrate on direct insurance only and not on reinsurance. So Claude, before diving into a few figures, what do we mean exactly by cross-border business, and what are the main business models we are talking about?
Well, thank you, Valérie. Well, at first sight, the answer seems obvious. Cross-border business is all business which is sold outside the country where an insurance company is headquartered. In fact, things are a bit more complicated. When engaging in foreign markets, an insurance company has a choice between different business models. The first business model would be to establish a subsidiary in another EU country to do business in this territory. A second model would be to establish a branch, which is also a permanent presence, but without the setup of a legal entity. And the third possibility is just to sell cross-border without a permanent presence in a given territory. From a legal perspective, the first possibility, that is to say the setup of a subsidiary, is commonly not considered to be cross-border business, for according to EU and even worldwide rules, normally supervision is carried out at legal entity level. So whenever you set up a subsidiary in a foreign country, it is outside the control of the supervisor of the parent company. It comes under the supervision of the host country. So that is not meant by cross-border business. Cross-border business is so limited to the establishment of branches, which is normally called freedom of establishment, or cross-border sales without establishment, which is called freedom to provide services. At EU level, there is an additional complication, for the EU directive are only speaking about freedom of establishment and freedom to provide services whenever the business is done in another country within the European Economic Area. So European directives neglect all the business which is done outside the EEA, and which for Luxembourg represents quite a large portion of its business. So, to resume myself, when we are speaking about cross-border business, we are just meaning freedom to provide services and freedom of establishment within the EU or the EEA.
Thank you, Claude. So Florent, if we now look at the figures, how is this cross-border element reflected in the live business carried out from Luxembourg? And have you seen an evolution since the past 5 years?
Thank you, Valérie. We've seen a reasonably stable set of numbers when it comes to life insurance premium, and that's been really between 25 and 30 billion euros per year. To Claude's point, most of that amount is cross-border by nature. 90 to 95% is on a cross-border basis. And within that, a very large part relates to EU or EEA. Okay. That's been obviously following, to a degree, the evolution of market dynamics. So we have seen that 2020, for instance, because of the pandemic, so a bit of a drop, of a decrease in overall premium. But the dynamic, the long-term dynamic, if we just look at the last 5 years, is quite positive in general, with a particular focus on certain markets. France, Italy, and Scandinavia, for instance, are leading the way. At Lombard, we're reasonably aligned with this market dynamics in terms of growth, but also in terms of country pattern. There's been obviously a very important development over the last 5 years, which has been Brexit, where a significant portion of life insurance premium was invested or came from the UK. The dynamic has changed post-Brexit, so that's no longer EU, obviously, but it remains an interesting market for some of the market players overall. So I would say it's a good dynamic, it's a solid foundation based on a resilient regulatory model, and we look forward to continue to grow in that space.
From a non-life perspective, we can clearly see a huge premium collection increase since 2019, and of course the impact of Brexit. So Richard, how important is this cross-border dimension in your day-to-day business, and has it been a decisive feature in choosing Luxembourg for your EU hub?
Thank you, Valerie. I mean, the short answer is yes, but I should probably go into a bit more detail. As you say, the non-life market has grown substantially in the last few years in Luxembourg. I think it's more than trebled since 2018, and income is now around 15 billion euros. I think most of that growth is cross-border business. From Convex's perspective, the vast majority of what we do is cross-border business. And when we look to set up a European entity, we factored in sort of many important things that included access to a skilled workforce, a strong, well-reputed regulator, and infrastructure within both the country and sort of links into the rest of Europe. We were in a slightly fortuitous position that Convex only started trading in 2019, and so Brexit was in motion but hadn't obviously been finalised, and we didn't have the same issue with as many other UK-based companies in terms of servicing European clients through that tricky period. So we were able to take a step back and take our time and think about, what we wanted to do. The end result of all of our explorations was Luxembourg. And for the reasons I've mentioned, and possibly another attractive feature was access to the Big Four accountants in setting up a business and being able to tap into lots of local expertise as part of that infrastructure. And so we've been up and running for just over a year now, and we're delighted with the choice we've made and for all the reasons I've mentioned.
Thank you. Claude, if we now compare Luxembourg insurance business to the European one, what would be your main observations?
Well, Valerie, let me please give some figures about the overall cross-border business within the EEA. The overall cross-border business represents 106 billion euros, which is roughly 9% of overall premiums written by European insurers. As mentioned by Petra, this percentage has gone up slightly over the last 2 years, but all in all, there has been more stagnation for already in 2010, when we exclude the UK, which is no longer a member of the European Union, we already were at 8%, so it's really not a big increase. There are two major players when it comes to selling cross-border business in Europe. That is Ireland, which is on the first seat with 34% of this 106 billion, followed by Luxembourg with 28%. So these two jurisdictions together represent more than 60% of cross-border business. When we restrict our view to life business, this percentage of these two jurisdictions would even be above 88% of all cross-border business. So now seen from a Luxembourg perspective, 70% of premiums written by Luxembourg insurance companies stem from cross-border business in the sense we have defined it, so business written within the EEA. If we were to add to this business the business written outside the EEA, the percentage would even go up to 93%. So we are really dependent on the cross-border international business written out of Luxembourg. The question is why? Why did Luxembourg succeed? Of course, there are reasons related to Luxembourg as a whole, such as political stability, regulatory stability, also to the extent possible, of course, due to ever-changing European directives, an appealing ecosystem, but there are also reasons more specific to the insurance sector. First, I think Luxembourg has a long-established experience in cross-border business. The first cross-border companies were the P&I clubs joining Luxembourg also already in the 1980s. There is the good repute of the place in itself. There is one of the arguments put forward by Brexit entrance to Luxembourg was the existence of a dedicated supervisor just dealing with insurance business. And of course, for life business, very important, the synergies with the financial sector as a whole. So perhaps a last question is, okay, we know where cross-border business comes from, but where goes it to? Yeah. I think there are two main countries which buy cross-border business within Europe. The first place is Italy, which buys roughly 28% of the 106 billion cross-border business, followed by France with 19%. These two countries are not the main buyers of cross-border business Europe-wide, but they are also the two main clients of the Luxembourg insurance industry. So perhaps it's not surprising that these two countries are the countries who press the most for more regulatory convergence. There's also always an underlying fear of regulatory arbitrage or things not being in the right way. But it is fair to say that although the imported cross-border business is important in absolute figures, normally for big countries, they only represent a small part, a small share of the markets. There are smaller jurisdictions, especially in the north of Europe, who are dependent on imported cross-border business for more than 50% of their premiums. And normally, these countries do not complain about any problems.
Thank you, Claude. So let's now focus on the regulatory framework and the trends we are seeing in terms of supervision. So cross-border business is generally perceived as adding an extra layer of complexity due to the variety of products insurers are offering. On that basis, there would be a need to ensure that both the insurer itself and its supervisor fully understand and assess the risks associated to the business underwritten on a cross-border basis. So Angus, coming back to the introductory words of Petra, do you see a causal link between the increase of cross-border business within the EU and the introduction of this concept into several EU regulations? Why cross-border business is currently being seen as riskier by European policymakers?
Okay, thanks, Valerie. I mean, I'd just like to start by echoing some of Petra's comments that, we definitely see that cross-border business brings a lot of benefits to the insurance market in Europe and to policyholders. And I think that's a really good starting point to frame the discussion. I mean, the perception that cross-border business is more risky, from what we see in our discussions, really relates to the actions of the few rather than the many. But unfortunately, the actions of the few outweigh the good actions and the good intentions of the many and dictate the policy discussions in Brussels. And that's where the discussions come from and what we see. I mean, I would like to take a step back and just say, more generally, we don't see a lot of insurance failures in Europe. I mean, EIOPA has done a lot of work on this. They have a database. Unfortunately, they don't extract the number of failures or cross-border failures specifically, but what we do know is that over the last 20 years, during the great financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, etc., quite a significant stressed economic time, there's been about 200 failures or near misses, as EIOPA categorises it. So very limited, and EIOPA themselves say that most of that happened before Solvency II was introduced, which gave the supervisors a lot of protection. So the issues the issues of the small number of players, I mean, I think as Petra also mentioned, EIOPA has done a lot of work on this already over the past few years with the Commission, and it's reporting success and reporting good developments there, which we support. But we now see the Solvency II review, which is ongoing. Cross-border supervision is a part of it, an important part for many players. But we see this as the opportunity to really make the changes that are needed to give people the comfort that they need to take it forward.
Thank you. Florent, I'm convinced you will have few messages here to relay.
Yeah, I mean, first, obviously, I think it's important to say, and coming back to Luxembourg, within the context of Europe, that Luxembourg is an important hub. Claude mentioned how important it is from a cross-border standpoint together with Ireland, and the fact that Luxembourg has developed its framework over the last few years, a couple of decades, is really important in terms of setting the scene for a solid, reputable cross-border business. Cross-border is incredibly important to a lot of end clients in the life insurance space. It's important because many of them look for asset diversification. Many of them look for solutions that are not necessarily available in the country where they reside. And they look for solutions that are resilient and that are competitive. And the cross-border business on the life insurance side, in particular, in my view, can provide a lot of that to those end clients. I don't believe that this is riskier, personally. On the contrary, I think that it's a risk diversification play that is available to many customers, and they can take advantage of that. I strongly believe in the model. We are seeing, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, we're seeing some pressure for some of the regulators, and Claude mentioned the two in particular that are more involved in that, with France and Italy. But the strength of the model is in my view, its diversification capability, and that's why cross-border is so important in insurance today.
Richard, do you agree?
I mean, I do agree. A lot of it's been covered already, but just from sort of a couple of other thoughts maybe. I think the way the world has evolved over the last few decades with M&A action means there are less insurers offering more coverage in more places, and by definition cross-border business is going to increase rather than decrease, and I think we just have to go with the times. I'm all for regulatory scrutiny and things being done on a consistent and professional basis. I think that's absolutely imperative to the product we offer to our clients that enables them to offer what they offer to their clients. Is it riskier? I don't believe so. I think every insurance business should be aware of the rules and regulations that they are subject to and the markets they operate in, and I don't strongly believe in that, certainly in the business that we write, that the sort of location of where we sit as a regulated entity matters too much in that respect.
Okay. Claude, do you have something to add?
Yes, perhaps first I think the fact that an added focus is given to cross-border cannot be explained by an increase of the market of cross-border. I have pointed out that this share of cross-border business has not much increased if we look not only the last 2 years, but over the decades, there is not really a big increase of cross-border business. I think the explanation is more to be seen in the few cases of mis-selling, of aggressive tariffs, and very often the underlying reason for this is a misunderstanding of the needs of the host market and the related risks. But I think that is also not the only explanation. I think there has been a pre-existing distrust against cross-border business in some jurisdictions. And this distrust has just been fueled by some mishaps which have happened in the past. And so there is a call for more convergence, and EIOPA and European Commission is responding to this. I would certainly agree with all the participants that per se cross-border business is not more risky than any other business. And when you enter new markets, you have to be aware of the risks in the same way as you have to be aware of risk when you enter into a new line of business. So that is nothing special for that. That is part of the day-to-day business of an insurance company to be aware of the risk. And when it comes to supervision, I would not advocate a special attention to cross-border business, which would go far beyond what is asked for the day-to-day supervision of all business of insurance companies. I think if we were to add a special task just for the sake of convergence, that would distract supervisors from their normal duties of supervision. It would eat time which could be spent better otherwise.
Thank you, Claude. Angus, coming back to you and being a bit more specific now, can you tell us more about the current proposals to change the Solvency II directive as it relates to supervision of cross-border business?
Yep, sure. I mean, so the European Commission issued its proposals on Solvency II and the IRRD back in September last year. And there was a number of changes proposed with respect to cross-border supervision. We can categorise these into three buckets, I would say. The first is the information from companies to supervisors. The second is the discussions between supervisors themselves. And then thirdly, the role of EIOPA in all these discussions. So maybe just drilling down a little bit, the extra information from companies to supervisors that's foreseen. I mean, I think the first thing to note is companies now have to disclose, well, under Commission's proposals, would have to disclose whether they've been rejected from authorisation or have had the authorisation rescinded. And there's the possibility for direct requests from host supervisors to the companies under certain circumstances. That's foreseen in the Commission's proposal. But what we see a bit more is the exchange of information between the NSAs, and this comes back to Claude's point around the understanding of the risks in the certain markets. And Article 33A, proposed by the Commission, introduces this idea of significant cross-border business or significant cross-border activities. And it creates the requirement for supervisors to assess if the undertaking has a clear understanding of the risks in that market with respect to the system of governance, outsourcing, etc. So I think that while that proposal's been understood, what's created a little bit of controversy is what is deemed to be significant. And under the Commission's proposal, they've proposed that if an undertaking has more than 5% of its gross written premiums in a given market, then that's considered significant. On top of that, there's some additional requirements. Article 159A proposes the exchange of solvency information, and then it's foreseen that there's joint on-site inspections if there's any solvency issues arising there, which can be called for by the host NSA. So finally, on EIOPA, what the Commission's proposed is for powers for EIOPA to mediate in collaboration platforms where there's a disagreement between the supervisors. And it's also proposed for EIOPA to have the powers to initiate an on-site inspection of its own accord. So that's broadly what the proposals cover. Mm-hmm. So that was from the Commission. And now, just before the summer, we had the European Council under the French presidency agree its general approach. And this is what we expect the Council to negotiate on in the trialogues discussions probably next year. Now, the Commission did stick quite close to the Council, stuck quite close to the Commission's proposal, I would say, overall. They foresaw a little less power for EIOPA, no power for them to initiate on-site inspections. But more importantly, I think they changed the definition of significant cross-border. So under the Council's proposal, there would be 2 criteria, either of which could be met by the company. The first is that they have 15 million of gross written premiums in a given jurisdiction. Or the second is that the host supervisor deems the activities to be significant under its own, like a qualitative assessment, as you will. So that was the Council. Now, finally, the Parliament have their ongoing discussions just now, so we don't know exactly where they're going to end up. But what we do know is that the Parliament, there's some new ideas in there, something quite different to what's been discussed by the Commission. Now, these have been tabled by the rapporteur, and what he foresees is that the collaboration platform could be extended to all cross-border business cases to facilitate the exchange of information between the supervisors and take away some of those other needs that have been proposed by the Commission. So, yeah, I should also mention that he's also taken away the possibility for a direct approach from the host NSA to the company. Yeah. Now that's the rapporteur's proposals. There was other amendments from the shadows and others which have slightly varying changes of vision. But overall, I think we see a little bit of convergence in the Parliament discussions, and we look forward to where they land.
And what are the key industry positions that we are fighting for at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think we recognise that host NSAs, at the secretariat level in our discussion with members, we recognise that the host supervisors probably it's justified for them to have a little bit more information, and we think it should be facilitated that can happen. We think there's a lot of merit in the rapporteur's idea to extend the use of collaboration platforms. However, we would caveat quite strongly that that it's not needed in all cases. In creating a collaboration platform under every single case of cross-border would create huge amounts of work and burden for supervisors, for companies, that's unnecessary. Mm-hmm. So what we would propose is that the collaboration platform idea is only used where it's been requested by the host or the home NSA in that particular case. We think they also would like to see the direct requests to companies really be quite tailored and only really used in exceptional circumstances. And under that idea, we also, when the host NSA goes for a direct request, if it's deemed necessary, then they should respect the fact that different types of information requests require different lengths of time, and the response from companies may be varied in that respect. So whether it's a standardised request or an ad hoc request will dictate how much time is needed for the company to respond to that request. So those are the key things that we would like to see coming out of the discussions.
Any idea or where are things likely to land?
Well, as I say, I think the good thing about cross-border business is that the cross-border supervision is that everyone has the same sort of intended outcome. It's to deal with these problem companies and hopefully not create too much burden for those other companies. So everyone's moving in the same direction broadly, and now it's fair to say that people's ideas of how we achieve those outcomes are very different, and the details are very important and will have impacts on companies and supervisors, so we do need to pay attention to the details. Mm-hmm. But certainly we're very hopeful that because everyone's moving in the right direction, the same direction, we will get a good outcome, and we will see the outcomes that we're looking for. But what I would say is, in terms of timeline, as I mentioned, the Parliament are still discussing cross-border as well as many of the other topics in Solvency II. Now, some of the other topics in Solvency II discussion are a bit more difficult than the cross-border. So we expect that actually the timeline foreseen by the Parliament initially might slip into next year, and the trialogues might be delayed a little bit into next year. So the timelines are slipping, and I think it's also important to reflect that cross-border is only one part of the bigger Solvency II discussion. And yeah, I mean, as I say, there's challenges with other parts of the discussion which could influence the cross-border discussion. So.
Okay, so political discussions are ongoing.
Yeah.
And we hope for something more pragmatic.
Exactly.
But however, it seems that this will be challenging discussions. So, having skimmed the Luxembourg perspective and the regulatory framework, time has come now to share your practical experience and to understand increasing impediments to your day-to-day cross-border business. So we have, as Florent, you mentioned, recently seen certain practices of local supervisors, which, according to us, constitute real attacks to the Luxembourg insurance sector. These practices crystallize the fear of seeing one of the EU fundamental freedoms, namely the freedom to provide services, being impeded in one or several sectors' main markets. So, Florent, are these attacks a real threat for the business model adopted by many life players in our sector? And could you please maybe give us some concrete examples?
Yes, well, first of all, as a business operator in this sector, I certainly welcome regulatory interactions. I welcome EIOPA's willingness to drive to some level of convergence and oversight, just for the purpose that it is aimed to avoid having specific regulators taking specific actions that could be contrary to the overall market dynamic and the overall market benefits. Yes, we have been seeing over the last few years some gradual increase and more aggressive behavior for some of the regulator in some large jurisdictions. Luxembourg is subject to professional secrecy. That's Article 300 of the life insurance sector, the law on life insurance sector. There are very strict constraints that go with the professional secrecy. When asked for data, and data is quite critical, by certain jurisdictions, we may have conflict of law that are very difficult for us to manage because we're being asked by certain authorities to provide in a certain way data which we cannot share without breaching local professional secrecy. That is an issue. That issue has increased over the last few years, which is why we believe as an industry that professional secrecy should be amended as well. We're also seeing a request for more targeted data, which relates to AML. We're seeing more attempts to localize freedom of service business. In certain markets, some of the market players have established either branches or subsidiaries, so there is a local presence, but that's not the case in every jurisdiction, and we are seeing certain countries being more strict or more demanding when it comes to permanent establishment requirements. So there are a number of factors today that we have to be very vigilant about, and we have to be very strict. Freedom of service, as Angus mentioned, is embedded in the law. I mean, it's European regulation. It is one of the pillars of free market within the EU. We have to make sure that through EIOPA, there is the appropriate level of convergence and that we do not have some of the markets that essentially decide to apply a certain interpretation of the regulation to their benefit, to their domestic market benefit, as opposed to the ability of end clients to benefit from a wider market.
Okay. Richard, what do you observe from a non-life side? And what are your views on the recent EIOPA's consultation on third country governance arrangements?
Firstly, I'd like to say that I think we sort of welcomed and received the consultation quite happily. I think it's highlighted with clarity many of the things we were focused on in our first year of setting up anyway. So that's sort of been a positive from our side. I think any regulated activities that are carried out carry risks with them. Part of our role and responsibilities is to make sure we mitigate those risks and have suitable controls in place and governance. Those risks will materialise regardless of whether it's in a head office or in a branch, so I don't think it's particularly important on that side. EIOPA should probably be happy that the sort of policyholders are being looked after in terms of the controls that are in place. And that ultimately is to the benefit of both policyholders and insurers alike, that there's a good rigid framework in place. I mean, international markets do provide benefits to EU customers with the products that are available. So my background originally is a sort of the aviation world, and you know, a lot of our clients are European airlines. A European airline not only insures its fleet for all its physical damage exposure, but obviously needs liability coverage to be able to fly, both first and third party. The limits that are required are substantial and need to be provided into the international market. We play a role in that space, and ultimately the policyholder, i.e. the airline, benefits from having a wide spectrum of insurers to trade with, a more competitive product, a more robust product, and ultimately that passes on to the ultimate customer, the public who are flying, and helps contribute to competitive air travel. So that's just one example of how the international non-life market can sort of help the ultimate sort of EU citizen. International non-life markets are incredibly diverse. They provide innovative solutions, and I think it's an important part of the sort of the world in which we operate.
Thank you. So having now those observations in mind, is an evolution of existing business models needed due to current challenging environment? And I will start with Angus from a broader perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a regulatory perspective, what we're trying to achieve in the Solvency II review is to provide those additional tools that are needed to make the existing business models work more effectively. So in answer to your question, I would say no, there's no evolution of business models needed. The exception to that would be the companies with the bad operators, shall we say, who perhaps do need to do a little bit more work on how they operate. But in general, no, I don't think any evolution of existing business models is needed.
Okay, thank you. Florent, what would be your position, notably considering maybe the new ways of working and their impact on running an international business?
Well, if we broaden the spectrum of the environment itself, we have a set of challenges which are quite relevant in the context of the cross-border business. We have obviously to look at new ways of working in a post-pandemic world. At Lombard, for instance, about half our workforce is made up of cross-border workers who live in France, in Belgium, and in Germany. And with governments encouraging work from home policies, there lies a risk around permanent establishment, in those countries. It's obviously an issue which is much wider than insurance itself. It's not an industry-specific issue. It's a workplace specific issue which will have to be tackled at the political level as well as at the tax level. But that's one area that is really a change that we're engaging on at Lombard and in the wider insurance community. Obviously, digitalization is also an important factor of continuing to be competitive in a cross-border environment as well as in the local environment, and the industry is engaged in that, we as well, to make sure that we can continue to offer with the appropriate channels, with the appropriate selling model and business strategies, the right product to the right end clients or through the right partners across multiple geographies in Europe. So those would be two key drivers of change that as operators we have to think about every day.
Yeah. Richard, any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a slightly fortuitous position in that we obviously only set up last year. So that was during the pandemic and we didn't have the same sort of issues to deal with. All of our staff are actually Luxembourg-based, so we don't have the same concerns around that. And I think just with the various circulars and consultations that have been coming out over the last 12 months, we've taken everything on board and been able to adapt our sort of evolution of our operating model to reflect those things that have been highlighted. So it's something we're quite blessed that we don't have so many issues on.
Thank you. So we are now slowly moving towards the end of our discussion. Looking back at the trends and challenges you just put forward, what does it mean for Luxembourg? And Claude, I will start with you. According to you, are these challenges impacting the attractiveness of Luxembourg in the more or less long term, and why?
Well, I would not say that the attractiveness of Luxembourg will be impaired by the upcoming changes regarding cross-border business. I think the rules will be the same for everyone, and as has been pointed out by Florent, some of the impediments to cross-border business are not due to prudential regulations, but to tax rules, employment rules, and so there will be no impact by the review of Solvency II. Of course, the additional rules brought about by the Solvency II review will come with a cost, and this cost will affect more the jurisdictions which, like Luxembourg, are deeply engaged in international business. But you have to see the picture as a whole. I think the advantages of having an integrated internal market where a company can do business from a single hub under the supervision of a single supervisor, even if the supervisor is working more and more together with supervisors from the host countries, that is still a big advantage, and this advantage outweighs additional costs, even if these costs are coming with new rules. And I give just an example. When the UK left the European Union, of course, UK insurers had a choice of different business models. They could have established subsidiaries in different EU jurisdictions instead of choosing one jurisdiction for a single hub and doing business out of there. All companies in the UK have opted for a single hub, and none has established subsidiaries. So I think companies see still the big potential coming from cross-border business, and I would not say that this is jeopardized in the future.
Florent, maybe you would like to react?
Yeah, I think that I would agree with what Claude is saying. We need to stay vigilant, you know, in the face of new and upcoming regulation. As you know, business operators, we never like adding costs because, you know, somehow something has to give, and profitability matters. So I say we have to remain vigilant because of the constant pressure we're seeing in this market from various regulatory bodies. But I would agree otherwise with the long-term trend that Claude mentioned.
And so pursuing on what you have just said, according to you, what is the level of awareness of the Luxembourg government and authorities?
I think it's quite high. Frankly, that's one of the key benefits of Luxembourg being a relatively small country compared to others, is that there's a very strong cohesiveness of various constituents. You know, we have regular interactions with the Minister of Finance through ACA. Of course, the CAA is a key party to how business is regulated and how business is conducted. The ecosystem around what is important for the success of Luxembourg as a country is very strong as well. I mean, Luxembourg for Finance through Nicolas Maquel does a great job at promoting the industry. So there is a vested interest, I would say, at the political level at making Luxembourg as competitive as possible and at keeping it on the map. I think there's the expression of, you know, punching above your weight. That's what Luxembourg is aiming to do, has been able to do for many, many years. And I think the political focus is there for it to continue. And that is really important for us, because as we push our issues and we present our issues to those constituents, we have their ear, they understand what the issue is, they understand that this can have negative impacts. And we feel like we are working together towards resolution of issues.
Okay, thank you. So to conclude now and rebound on the headline of this expert talk, a final question for each of you. What's the future of cross-border insurance in Luxembourg? Will it be bright or at stake? And Angus, it might be tough, but I will start with you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, maybe I won't speak specifically about Luxembourg. My comments maybe a bit more generally about the European market. And I mean, ultimately, I think I'm quite optimistic. I mean, from what I see, there is a willingness at political level to keep the single market, to keep the integrity of the single market. The Solvency II review gives us the opportunity to make the changes we need to facilitate cross-border supervision a little bit better. I see industry willing to play its part. I hope on the supervisor side they can also come to the agreements they need to exchange information and feel more comfortable about how the companies are operating in their markets. And overall, as I say, I think there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out still under the discussions in the Parliament, and then obviously during trialogues there's going to be more discussion. But overall, I'm optimistic, as I say, on what's going to be the outcome, and I think that leads to a bright answer to your question, both for the European, but particularly for Luxembourg.
Yeah, thank you. Richard, what would be your thoughts since you became only recently a recent Luxembourg player?
Thank you, Valerie. I think from our perspective, I would have to say that the future seems bright to me. I've been obviously heavily involved over the last year with setting up our business. I've been very impressed by the general infrastructure around the insurance market, the regulator, the work you do at ACA. I think to echo the points made already, the general sort of local communication is fabulous and shouldn't be underestimated. There is access to skilled workforce. You know, we've touched on the issues around pandemic and dealing with that, but I think the accessibility to a skilled workforce, the Big Four, and the sort of geographical location of Luxembourg makes it a very attractive proposition, to be honest. And we certainly are very, very happy with the choice we've made.
Mm-hmm. Claude, according to you, will the success story continue?
Well, I think so. I think the freedom to engage in cross-border business is at the very heart of European internal market, and no one wants to put that at stake. Of course, there will have to be adaptations in the future. Some adaptations might seem to give place to worries when we are just in front of new tasks. But Luxembourg has always proved to be able to cope with these new challenges and even to turn challenges into new success stories. Mm-hmm. Just give example, Brexit or Solvency II with internal models, where Luxembourg is now developing as a center of competence for internal models. So let's look with confidence in the future.
So Florent, the final word is for you.
Thank you. I am confident. There is also, of course, a level of attention we need to continue to have. Mm-hmm. The market remains quite competitive for cross-border players. If we look at the life insurance space, for instance, about 3/4 of that is made up of unit-linked life insurance, and there are quite complex assets that may be in there. The ability to continue to price at the right level, to generate the adequate margins, to make that market successful is really important. Mm-hmm. In addition to, as Richard said, getting the right skills. And we know that in the compliance space, in the risk management space, in the technology space, it can be a little bit difficult to get to the right level, the right quantity, because the pool is somewhat limited. But I'm confident and attentive to making sure that we continue to be successful.
Mm-hmm. So this concludes our expert talk, very rich in exchange of views. So today, more than ever, a harmonized approach at EU level is a key element for a successful industry and for a competitive and integrated insurance market. As recently mentioned by our Minister of Finance, insurance players need smart regulation in the EU financial sector to ensure openness, and strengthen competitiveness. So thank you to all of you behind your screens for following us this morning, and thank you to my panelists for their involvement, their availability and the interactive discussion. Nathalie, it's time now to move on the second session of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. This is clearly an important issue with some serious implications for our industry. Now, moving to an issue which affects us collectively as an industry, but also as private individuals. The acceleration of climate change and the increasing severity of natural events is undeniable. Natural catastrophes are becoming the new norm. Leading our next discussion is Leah Zanda, and she will be interviewing Ivo Hux, General Manager of Swiss Re, where they will be discussing some of the challenges affecting the reinsurance sector today. Over to you, Leah.
Merci Nathalie, et bienvenue à tous et à toutes dans ce nouveau In Discussion With. Cette année, nous avons décidé de dédier cette discussion à la délicate question de la réassurance face aux défis climatiques. Un vaste sujet d'une importance capitale, car le changement climatique est partout et nous ne pouvons plus l'ignorer. L'actualité nous le rappelle sans cesse, et l'été 2022 ne nous a rien épargné. Canicules, inondations, sécheresses et plus récemment tempêtes. Les derniers rapports du groupe d'experts intergouvernemental sur l'évolution du climat montrent que le dérèglement s'intensifie partout dans toutes les régions du monde, à des niveaux sans précédent. Au moment où nous tournons ce In Discussion With, se tient la COP27, la 27e conférence de l'ONU sur le climat. Elle rassemble quelques 110 dirigeants pour 2 semaines au chevet d'une planète malade. Le changement climatique est désormais l'un des plus grands risques auxquels notre économie mondiale et notre société sont confrontées. Pour la première fois, le financement des dégâts climatiques figure même à l'agenda de cette conférence. Selon une estimation de Swiss Re, les pertes économiques liées aux catastrophes naturelles s'élèvent à 72 milliards de dollars au premier semestre 2022. La facture atteint même 38 milliards de dollars pour les assureurs. À Luxembourg, les tempêtes et inondations des 3 dernières années ont coûté à elles seules 230 millions d'euros. Ces chiffres donnent le tournis, il y a urgence et les assureurs et réassureurs ont un rôle important à jouer. Alors quels défis les assureurs et les réassureurs vont devoir relever pour répondre à cette urgence climatique? Quelles solutions sont envisagées? Pour répondre à ces questions, j'ai l'immense plaisir de recevoir Ivo Hux, General Manager à Luxembourg pour Swiss Re. Ivo, tu as presque 30 ans d'expérience dans le secteur de la réassurance et tu as fait toute ta carrière à Swiss Re. Peux-tu, s'il te plaît, te présenter en quelques mots à nos spectateurs?
Bonjour Léa, merci beaucoup. Effectivement, j'ai gravi les échelons au sein du groupe Swiss Re, où j'ai dirigé plusieurs marchés, dont depuis 2018 la France, le Benelux et la Suisse. Et depuis 2018, je suis dirigeant agréé ou General Manager, Country President au Luxembourg.
Merci Ivo. Les chiffres que nous avons évoqués à l'instant ont de quoi nous inquiéter. Qu'est-ce qui est nouveau et qui doit, selon toi, être pris en compte pour 2023 ? Qu'est-ce qui a changé ces dernières années pour notre industrie ?
Effectivement, quand on regarde les chiffres, on se rend compte que l'impact des sinistres climatiques a augmenté dans notre résultat et est devenu beaucoup plus grave. Seulement, tu as mentionné la première moitié de cette année, nous avons vu jusqu'à maintenant, en 2022, des sinistres incroyablement lourds, comme en Australie les inondations, même chose pour l'Afrique du Sud ou pour le Pakistan. On a vu en Europe des feux de forêt suivis ou engendrés par une sécheresse grave, et tout récemment, un ouragan en Floride. Donc effectivement, c'est devenu une charge beaucoup plus importante que dans le passé. Alors qu'est-ce qu'on observe ? On observe une fréquence plus importante de sinistres, où la diversification qu'on avait dans le passé au niveau global sur une base annuelle joue moins que dans le passé. On a aussi une intensité, donc une sévérité des dégâts qui augmente. Prenons l'exemple des grêles en France au mois de juin, avec des grêlons d'une taille inouïe qu'on n'a jamais vue dans le passé. Et tout ça combiné avec une situation économique qui se reflète d'abord dans un contexte inflationniste en ce qui concerne le coût de réparation une fois les dégâts subis. Et en même temps, on a aussi une inflation, ce qu'on appelle sociale, donc dans certaines juridictions, comme par exemple la Floride, où c'est très litigieux et donc la jurisprudence est coûteuse pour l'indemnisation.
D'accord. Et quand on parle de ces défis climatiques, on parle beaucoup de déficit de protection et aussi de périls secondaires. Et en fait, ce que je voulais voir avec toi, c'est déjà qu'est-ce qu'on appelle un déficit de protection. Si tu peux nous en parler en quelques mots.
Tu as mentionné au début des chiffres, les 72 milliards de dégâts et les 38 milliards d'assurances payées. La différence, les 24 milliards, c'est justement ce qu'on appelle un écart de protection, un déficit de protection. C'est des sinistres non assurés et donc il n'y a personne ou quelqu'un d'autre qui doit payer que l'assureur. Et c'est dommage parce que ça insinue un problème économique pour certains acteurs. Ce n'est pas un problème du tiers-monde. Tu prends le Luxembourg avec les inondations l'année dernière, tu peux avoir un effet où une maison était assurée, une autre n'était pas assurée contre l'inondation. Tu peux avoir en 2023 ou 2024 un problème de sous-assurance parce que les sommes assurées n'ont pas été ajustées à l'inflation, par exemple. Ou même pour les inondations, tu prends les dégâts à l'infrastructure qui doivent être payés par le budget de l'État.
D'accord, donc une différence importante. Ivo, nous voyons une citation de Jérôme Jean Hegeli, économiste en chef du groupe Swiss Re, qui s'affiche à l'écran. Qu'est-ce que cette citation t'inspire et peux-tu, s'il te plaît, la commenter un petit peu pour nous ?
Oui, le chiffre est juste très important, les 75% non assurés. Ceci veut dire que quand on prend le rôle de l'assurance comme un stabilisateur de la société où on sert à équilibrer une économie dans le temps, l'assurance ne peut pas jouer son rôle dans beaucoup de cas. Donc la résilience sociétale est moindre avec cette sous-assurance. Donc ça crée une incertitude. Cette incertitude, elle existe pour nos pays à nous, mais surtout aussi pour des pays émergents, bien sûr.
Et donc, à côté de ce déficit de protection s'ajoute, et on en entend de plus en plus parler, notamment ces 2 dernières années, les secondary perils ou périls secondaires. Si on parle de ces secondary perils, ça veut dire qu'il y en a des primary. Est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer un peu la différence entre les deux, peut-être ?
Oui. Pour un réassureur, dans le passé, je dis les 100 dernières années, on se focalisait sur les 4 grands périls mondiaux qui ont créé les risques d'accumulation importants pour un réassureur. C'était l'ouragan Atlantique, surtout pour la côte de l'Est américaine. C'était le tremblement de terre en Californie, c'était le tremblement de terre au Japon, et pour l'Europe, c'était la tempête hivernale.
D'accord, donc on avait ces 4 grands périls, et à ça s'ajoutent maintenant des périls secondaires. Et est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer pourquoi ils ne doivent pas être négligés ? Pourquoi ils sont plus importants maintenant ?
Alors, dans le passé, on se focalisait sur les grands et en les tarifant et comprenant bien, on avait une situation stable et techniquement bien maîtrisable. Entre-temps, comme on vient de découvrir dans la première partie de cette discussion, les effets d'autres périls que les 4 que je viens de mentionner sur le bilan d'un réassureur ou d'un assureur sont devenus beaucoup plus importants. Et en même temps, dans le passé, on n'avait pas investi suffisamment de ressources pour la bonne compréhension de ces risques, pour la bonne tarification. Parfois, on n'a même pas pris de primes et c'était inclus globalement en sommaire dans des couvertures. Entre-temps, il s'avère qu'il faut investir beaucoup plus dans la compréhension, dans la bonne maîtrise, y compris les cumuls et la tarification. Donc, il y a un vrai besoin collectif, je dirais, d'une meilleure compréhension, y compris de collecte de données pour accompagner ce mouvement vers une couverture adéquate, appropriée et techniquement durable sur ces périls secondaires.
D'accord. Donc, comme on vient de le voir, en fait, on a des événements climatiques qui sont de plus en plus nombreux, avec une intensité et un coût final qui augmentent, qui dépassent tout ce qu'on avait pu voir. En tant qu'industrie d'assurance et de réassurance, comment abordez-vous ce vaste sujet et avez-vous des solutions ?
Je pense que le spectre des actions est assez large. Je commencerai par la prévention. Tout d'abord, il faut éviter un sinistre, un dégât. Après, on peut l'accompagner. Et là-dedans, il y a un travail avec les autorités publiques. On parle de codes de construction pour le tremblement de terre, on parle de zones inondables à définir et des cartographies hydrologiques à mettre à jour pour les autorités publiques. On parle d'une cartographie adaptée et un environnement légal qui sait encadrer déjà l'urbanisation et la croissance des valeurs, surtout dans des zones souvent plus exposées que dans le passé. Ça, c'est pour la prévention. Après, on parle, comme je viens d'expliquer pour les périscondaires, on parle d'une bonne compréhension des risques. De quoi part-on ? Est-ce qu'on a les statistiques nécessaires, les données ? Et bien évidemment, une tempête de grêle est peut-être un peu plus difficile à modéliser qu'une tempête hivernale où on se focalisait surtout sur la vitesse des vents et l'impact sur les bâtiments. Une fois qu'on a une bonne compréhension des périls, on peut aborder la protection. C'est notre cœur de métier. Et comme on a découvert qu'il y a un déficit de protection, il y a un potentiel de croissance, bien sûr, pour l'assurance des dons, mais il faut que les produits soient adaptés. Qui ait aussi une certaine vertu en ce qui concerne la relation entre l'assuré et l'assureur. Donc on parle de franchise adaptée, on parle peut-être d'accompagnement dans la prévention pour l'assureur. Et en même temps, je pense, l'assureur, il y a aussi une obligation morale, je dirais, d'élargir l'offre pour bien accompagner ce changement climatique et pour continuer à assurer la stabilité sociétale. Dans certains pays où l'indemnisation basée sur une expertise après sinistre est un peu plus compliquée, on peut aussi introduire des produits plutôt modernes, récents, qui s'appellent produits paramétriques, ou sur base d'un indice. Ça peut être index, ça peut être la vitesse de vent, ça peut être en tremblement de terre une échelle Richter, ça peut être un niveau de fluvial. On peut dégager des paiements rapidement.
Donc à partir du moment où l'indice est atteint,
et dépassé, la protection joue.
Ouais.
Et elle est prédéfinie, les paiements sont prédéfinis et on n'a pas besoin d'abord d'un expert sur le terrain. Ça se fait aussi dans le contexte de protection du gouvernement qui ont besoin des premiers fonds en urgence après événement, juste pour organiser le déblaiement, la première aide, etc. Et c'est des fonds qui sont immédiatement disponibles. Ça se fait surtout dans des pitières où c'est des programmes parfois sponsorisés aussi avec la Banque mondiale, par exemple.
D'accord. Donc prévention, compréhension des risques, protection, donc c'est trois éléments qui auront forcément un impact positif. Et j'ai lu que ces solutions ont déjà été mises en place, notamment chez vous au sein de Suisse Re. Tu m'as parlé également de deux autres pistes pour lesquelles en fait, des discussions sont encore en cours et parce qu'en fait, ça demande aussi des discussions avec d'autres parties prenantes. Et peux-tu nous en dire un peu plus sur ces éléments ?
Je pense qu'il y a deux acteurs qu'on a oubliés dans la discussion jusqu'à maintenant, qui sont importants aussi dans l'accompagnement. Un acteur, c'est le régulateur. Et le régulateur vient de prendre conscience aussi de l'importance des défis climatiques, bien sûr aussi un accompagnement de l'évolution politique avec une volonté de limiter le changement climatique. Et c'est d'une certaine manière aussi vertueux. Pensons par exemple au stress test que les régulateurs ont défini ou vont introduire maintenant aussi en Europe, qui nous force à bien appréhender le sujet, à collecter les données et parfois aussi à appuyer nos engagements avec du capital supplémentaire quand on se rend compte qu'avec certains scénarios, peut-être on pourrait dépasser la limite du confortable. Ça, c'est un des acteurs. L'autre acteur, je pense aux autorités publiques dans le sens large. Je pense qu'on a une obligation de réfléchir à une extension de l'assurabilité dans le futur. Nous parlions des inondations au Luxembourg ou dans certains autres pays, par exemple, ce péril est obligatoirement assurable. Mais ça demande souvent une action concertée entre les autorités qui définissent un cadre et le marché privé. Parfois, on recourt aussi à une étape de collaboration entre les deux, en créant un pool, par exemple, ou en associant, par exemple en France, l'État comme, je dirais, réassureur de dernier ressort, si jamais les capacités de marché sont exploitées.
Merci beaucoup Ivo. Et au-delà de ces éléments de réflexion, tu me confies en préparant ce In Discussion With que certains réassureurs, dont Swiss Re, vont déjà plus loin dans leur démarche et considèrent que leur politique d'investissement et ou de souscription doivent également être adaptées pour avoir un réel impact. Concrètement, comment est-ce que ça se traduit ?
Oui, je pense qu'il y a un engagement moral qu'on va prendre. Et ce n'est pas juste les réassureurs d'ailleurs qui ont commencé, aussi les assureurs. Et 3 pistes. Parlons des investissements. Là, on peut bien définir dans quel cadre on veut investir, qu'est-ce qu'on exclut, certaines industries par exemple, qu'est-ce qu'on accompagne dans la transition et où est-ce qu'on se focalise. On peut aussi investir délibérément sur des nouvelles formes d'énergie, par exemple dans les éoliennes, pour accompagner cette transition énergétique prévue par l'Union européenne. Sur le passif, donc, en ce qui concerne notre propre politique de souscription, qu'on a depuis longtemps, mais qu'on raffine chaque année, on peut définir aussi des exclusions, donc des industries qu'on ne veut plus appuyer en réassureur. Et tu as peut-être vu dans la presse les derniers mois, il y avait des discussions autour de nouvelles pipelines, par exemple, ou des forages un peu en Arctique assez exposés. Et on peut aller plus loin dans la décarbonisation, je dirais, de notre propre portefeuille de souscription. Et dernière chose, je pense qu'on a aussi un engagement en tant que compagnie en ce qui concerne notre propre empreinte carbone. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour réduire notre propre empreinte ? Chez nous, c'est surtout le voyage et les immeubles, donc la consommation énergétique. Et là, il y a un plan d'action pour être neutre en 2030. Tout ça s'inscrit, je pense, au niveau global maintenant déjà, dans un engagement assez important par l'industrie. Et les plus engagés se sont alliés autour d'un engagement qui s'appelle Net Zero Insurance Alliance, qui vient d'être créé cette année, où il y a des engagements fermes pour la propre empreinte carbonique et aussi l'engagement en souscription.
D'accord. Je crois savoir également que les réassureurs préparent actuellement le renouvellement 2023. Peux-tu, s'il te plaît, nous rappeler, pour les moins aguerris d'entre nous, brièvement de quoi il s'agit ?
Bon, un renouvellement chez nous, c'est une reconduction des contrats. Normalement, un assureur se protège sur base annuelle avec son réassureur, et en Europe, c'est normalement pour le 1er janvier de l'année suivante. Donc actuellement, on est en pleine renégociation des traités qui se fait normalement entre octobre et décembre pour l'année prochaine. Donc
vous êtes en plein dedans. Et donc dans le cadre de ce renouvellement 2023, quels sont les nouveaux défis auxquels vous êtes confrontés qui sont liés à ces risques climatiques justement ?
Mais je pense qu'il y a une réalité de terrain en ce qui concerne les sinistres d'une part, un contexte inflationniste qui demande aussi donc d'acheter plus de capacités ensuite auprès des réassureurs. Donc l'équilibre entre offre et demande s'est corrigé un peu et nous nous attendons maintenant à une augmentation des prix suite à cet effet de contrainte de capacité qui peut exister sur certains marchés, surtout les plus exposés comme l'ouragan américain.
Oui. Et en préparant ce In Discussion With, j'ai lu beaucoup sur le sujet. Et j'ai eu l'étrange impression, un peu d'une certaine résignation de certains acteurs. Enfin, je ne vais pas dire que c'est un peu la fin du monde, mais des fois, ça donne un petit peu cette impression. J'avais envie de te demander, Ivo, si pour toi, il reste quand même un peu d'espoir.
De l'espoir et de l'engagement. Je pense jamais plus qu'aujourd'hui, les acteurs étaient conscients de l'urgence et notre industrie en premier lieu. Ouais. Et on s'y engage et on se le doit pour nos investisseurs, pour nos enfants, ouais. Pour les jeunes générations qui veulent joindre notre industrie, qui attendent de nous qu'on continue à accomplir cette mission sociétale qu'on s'était donnée il y a 150, 200 ans.
Comme nous l'avons vu, certaines pistes pour répondre à cette urgence climatique ne sont pas encore toutes tracées. Une chose est sûre, il y a une réelle nécessité pour les différents acteurs, assureurs, réassureurs, États et particuliers, de travailler ensemble sur de véritables solutions pour aujourd'hui, mais également, comme tu le disais, pour les générations futures. L'urgence climatique ne va pas se régler individuellement, mais collectivement, et chaque acteur doit faire sa part. Et nous pouvons être rassurés aujourd'hui, en tout cas nous avons la forte impression et la forte conviction que les assureurs et les réassureurs vont faire la leur. Merci Ivo pour avoir accepté notre invitation et pour avoir partagé ta vision et ton expérience en la matière. Sur une touche finale, tu as récemment annoncé ton départ de Luxembourg pour retourner en Suisse. Nous te souhaitons au nom de toute l'équipe de l'ACA beaucoup de succès pour la suite et nous te remercions encore pour ta participation active au sein de notre association, en tant que membre du conseil d'administration bien sûr, mais également en tant que président de la commission réassurance. Merci à vous tous de nous avoir écoutés, merci à vous d'avoir participé à ce nouveau In Discussion With. Nathalie, la parole est à toi.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you, Ivo. So perhaps just to recap on some of the key points that have been raised today. We are optimistic that there is a bright future ahead for the Freedom to Provide Services business model. We have some work to do, but the founding principles are still valid and still strong. The issue of climate change reform is more complex. There are some ambitious targets ahead, and at an individual level, we each play a role in reaching that transition. So perhaps to close, just to remind you that all of the materials from today are available on our website, www.acainsuranceday.lu. The webinar is available in replay and in podcast format, and we invite you to share it as widely as possible with all of your contacts and on social media in order to promote the work that we're doing. I want to thank you again, and I wish you a great day.